Hi.
Hi, hi,
Hello.
hi, Ravi. Sorry, I was on a call and just got delayed. Yeah. And then um, 1 second. So we can start
Yeah,
now, right?
yeah,
And I can do the.
yeah. I'm starting. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the first Tasveer Author Meet of the year. We are so excited to have you with us this evening. Tonight, we welcome our guests, Dr. Ravi Shankar and Professor Sri Rekha Subramaniam, who are joining us to discuss Dr. Shankar's latest memoir, Correctional. Before I dive into introductions, a few words about Tasveer. We are a Seattle based nonprofit arts organization whose mission is to bring about social change through thought provoking South Asian films, literature, and storytelling. 2020 is a very special year for us. It marks 20 years of service in the industry and bringing about change in the community. We've also come up with a host of new ventures and programs: Tasveer TV, Tasveer Open Mic, and Tasveer Book Club, to name a few. Please be sure to check us out at tasveer.org to know more about our programs, or you could follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Now, back to the event. Please welcome our author and guest, Dr. Ravi Shankar. Dr. Shankar is a Pushcart Prize winning poet, translator, and professor who has published 15 books, including the Muse India award winning translations Andal, The Autobiography of a Goddess, and The Many Uses of Mint, New and Selected Poems 1997 to 2017. He has won awards to the Corporation of Yaddo and the McDowell Colony, fellowships from the Rhode Island and Connecticut Council on the Arts. He has founded one of the oldest electronic journals of the arts, Drunken Boat, and is the chairman of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translators, and has recently finished his PhD from the University of Sydney. His memoir, Correctional, which is today's topic of discussion, was published in 2021 with the University of Wisconsin Press, and he teaches creative writing at Tufts University. So, welcome, Dr. Shankar. We're glad to have you here. And joining him in conversation is Professor Sri Rekha Subramaniam. Professor Subramaniam is a professor of humanities at University of Houston Clear Lake. She was a first of the Marilyn Mizkuk Professorship in Women's Studies established at her university in 2008. Professor Subramaniam published the monograph Women Writing Violence, the Novel and Radical Feminist Imaginaries, Sage India 2013. She works on feminist and carceral texts from South Asian, African American, and diasporic traditions. Thank you both for agreeing to have this, what I'm sure is going to be a very riveting discussion. And audience, thank you so much for joining us, and feel free to post your questions in the comment section. Now, without further ado, I will hand it over to Professor Subramaniam to take the evening forward. Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ishita and Tasveer. Uh, and I would like to just start this event by inviting Dr. Ravi Shankar to read a passage that he's feeling right now, whatever direction he wants to go in with this wonderful memoir. So that's where we should begin.
Okay, and thank you again, Ishita and Tasveer. It's so great to be here with Rekha, who actually, and maybe we'll get to this, but was really kind of instrumental in helping me shape the final version of this. And I thought I might start by reading from the epilogue, the very end of the book. And so these are just the last few pages, and then we can talk about the trajectory and how we kind of arrived at this place. All right. As every aspect of my life continued to come under attack for my own recuperation, I felt the need to return to Hartford Correctional, 5 years after I had spent 90 days of my life there. I wanted to breathe in the sweat and moldy cinder block masked over by industrial cleaner. Sit in the visiting room in which Julie had waited for hours to speak to me through plexiglass, nearly being denied the opportunity due to wearing a sleeveless summer dress. Perhaps reconnect with some of the men who might still be there. I had kept their pain alive, even as I secured my own freedom. And I still had their inmate numbers and their nicknames. Suppose I wanted to experience something akin to what veterans of war might feel upon revisiting a village they had occupied years before. But it was not to be. All my letters to the men whose inmate numbers I still had went unanswered. The Connecticut Chief State's Attorney and Commissioner of the Department of Corrections ignored my request to speak to them. And then all correctional facilities went into lockdown due to the outbreak of COVID-19, a disease that first emerged late in 2019 in China and spread to the rest of the world the following year. The risk of infection and transmission was particularly high in jails because of inferior health care, little access to proper hygiene, overcrowding, a general lack of testing, and a flux of bodies going in and out. There was no way I was going to be able to visit. Faced with the dilemma of wanting to re-enter a carceral space but being prohibited from doing so, I was forced to confront my own motivations in wanting to return to jail in the first place. Was I some kind of anthropological tourist who had gone through an unfortunate time and wanted to capitalize on those experiences by writing this very book? Certainly my personal circumstances were very different than most of the men I met while incarcerated. I'd come from a life of relative privilege and returned to that life even if I had constant reminders of what I'd been through and how much I'd lost. Formerly a tenured full professor, now I couldn't even be hired as an adjunct to teach expository writing. Even when I had 10 times as many positive evaluations and recommendations and publications to the 2 misdemeanors on my record that show up with every background check, the latter were all that seemed to matter. Julie told me in the aftermath of my incarceration, the enduring, reverberating public shaming, I had changed shape. I was now a round peg, still trying to force my way into a square hole. To lose my tribe was devastating, but it compelled me to connect to real people such as those working in criminal justice reform. I met with a gardener in Providence who uses the cultivation of vegetables as one way to teach inmates actual skills that will allow them to become apprentice gardeners upon their release. I ran a writing workshop for a professional chef who teaches culinary techniques to young adults in the Department of Youth Services in Rhode Island. I met a former Florida cop who had risen all the way up the ranks to become a member of President Obama's task force in 21st century policing, who described how over-policing certain communities and the incestuous relationship between some prosecutors' offices and police departments has led to a corroding distrust in democracy. Well aware of my own difficulties finding employment, I made an appointment with the director of a nonprofit that helps prisoners reintegrate into society. What she told me confirmed my worst fears. We're not a forgiving society, Mr. Shankar. The rates of unemployment are over 5 times higher for those who have a criminal record than those who do not. Prisoners are stereotyped on the basis of a conviction, and the kinds of jobs I help them get, they're lowest of the low. If I can get someone hired as a dishwasher or janitor, it's a great success. If they can become a skilled laborer or a plumber or a barber, we celebrate it like we've landed a rocket on the moon. The irony, she paused a long time, that these men and women are some of the hardest workers, the cleverest people I've ever met. And I've been on Capitol Hill and lunched at Harvard. They're sorry for their mistakes and want to contribute to society, but no one wants to give them a second chance. And that's why the rates of recidivism are so high. These men and women want to work when they get out and have a stable family life, but guess what? If they can't pull down a steady paycheck, how the pinch are they supposed to resist the streets? The most transformative thing I did was join And Still We Rise, a Boston-based company run by Dev Luthra, a classically trained Shakespearean actor dedicated to telling the stories of those whose lives have been affected by incarceration. We get together every Thursday online, though I'm told that in the past it was in a black box theater where everyone would improv and tableau. Now we put together ensemble theater pieces through video, and even as we generate new material and practice our blocking, we support one another through a crisis of housing or family difficulty, uplifting one another through art and companionship. It's the kind of community theater group I would never have dreamed of joining while I was at Columbia, and yet I feel more invested and alive with them than ever. While I've been beleaguered and beaten down many times over the past decade, being part of this group reminds me weekly that even in my darkest moments, my privileges inoculated me to a certain extent from the daily injustices faced by the Black and Latino communities, women, and the poor. Above all, this group reminds me to be humble, to be grateful. A lesson that is never finished but takes the work of a lifetime to remember and to enact. Lois, a grandmother and reformed drug addict who falls on stage and screen into character so convincingly, it takes my breath clear down to my beating heart, tells me about her family. I'm a mother of 4 sons, and each of them has been in and out of jail since they were little. First youth services, then the state penitentiary, then halfway houses. But they're good boys. I raised them to know right from wrong. I had to work 3 jobs to pay the rent when they're growing up, so I wasn't around as much as I wanted to be. Sometimes I blame myself. But then other times I think it's just the price of being Black in America. We didn't ask to be here, but here we are. I guess I just feel blessed that they're still alive. In December 2020, a year that saw the death of George Floyd, Rashard Brooks, Daniel Prude, and Breonna Taylor at the hands of police, a crane lifted a nearly 3,000-pound bronze statue from its granite pedestal, not far from where I live in Boston's Park Square, where it has stood since 1879. The Emancipation Group Memorial, itself a replica of a Washington, D.C. statue depicting a godlike, fully attired Abraham Lincoln standing over a kneeling, near-naked, still shackled Black man. The man is, according to historian Kirk Savage, the very archetype of slavery. He is stripped literally and figuratively, bereft of personal agency, social position, and accoutrements of culture. Frozen forever in this unfortunate juxtaposition, the monument is not really about emancipation, but about its opposite, domination. The better visual embodiment of white savior complex has ever been crafted. I don't know what it could be. Moreover, as cited in the Washington Post in 2011, of the more than 5,000 public statues depicting historical figures in public squares and parks throughout the United States, less than 400 of these monuments are of women. We don't have to look hard to see how racism and sexism color our governmental institutions and permeate our consciousness. Spearheaded by Boston artist Tory Bullock, the Boston Art Commission decided in 2020 to take down the statue, giving it the same fate as all the other Confederate and colonialist monuments around the country. Statues, unfortunately, are easier to move than minds. All it takes is a crane to hoist an offensive reminder of our history onto the back of a flatbed truck to be buried in some official depot's basement. But the reverberations of that colonialist mentality continues in the inner workings of everyday life and stays buried within our institutions. Just by making a statue disappear or by entombing an entire class of people in prison, we'll never heal the original wound that arises from the fact that nation building has been a brutal, racist, inequitable practice that unjustly shapes the lives of generations of citizens. For true reparation to happen, we must acknowledge the enduring legacy of injustice by confronting those who've been wronged and ourselves directly, while also doing the policy work behind the scenes to transform policing, adjudication, sentencing, parole, and reintegration. My own life only briefly overlaps with these larger social justice imperatives, though my experiences have made it impossible for me to avert my gaze while those around me suffer, and while others around me either intentionally or complicitly help to cause that suffering. Those generations who come after us may well look at mass incarceration and social media shaming the way we regard medieval bishops who, while building exquisite cathedrals, also came up with ingenious ways to torture their fellow human beings. We refuse each other's subjectivity because we're scared of difference. But your pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness don't threaten mine, so long as we can agree on the assumption of privilege that puts that goal at unequal distances for each of us. I began working on this book because I promised the men of Dorm 4 in Hartford Correctional that I would help share their stories. They might never have the chance to get their voice back from the court documents and psychiatric records, but I can use mine to loosen their closed fists and reveal our shared humanity. Those men are all around us. I'm one of them. I've had to reclaim my own voice from the Hartford Current, from the blogosphere, from Amma and Appa, from the lies I told myself because I was hurting and did not know how to confront the pain. I knew how to mask it, but never could quite drink or drug or fuck it away. There is so much I wish I could whisper in the ear of that awe-stricken boy lying on his back in a rooftop in Madras, watching the swirl of stars overhead in a delicious moment of respite from the sweltering summer heat. Everything seemed imbued with such magical possibility. My cousins and I were separated by oceans, but we were family. You could eat sweet pungal with your hands or cornflakes with a spoon for breakfast. Somehow, Pac-Man had reached the shores of India, but not Donkey Kong. It all made perfect sense. Now I wake up each morning with the intention of perceiving again with such non-judgmental curiosity. Some days, when I wrap my arms around my beloved, laughing after getting off the phone with my daughters, our dog sniffing and wagging around our feet, miso soup on the stove, and the Japanese maple flaring darkly crimson in the window, everything seems so tender and possible and alive and intended. Just never imagined that I would have to lose so much to come this close to feeling free again.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Ravi, for that. Very beautiful, evocative epilogue to your novel that I appreciate listening to it because that was new for me after reading your novel several times over in the past couple of years. It was wonderful to hear you. And that final sentence really rings home for me about how much you have to lose to be free again. And I have just so many questions for you, Ravi. So I am just bursting here. But, when I was listening to you, when you opened the portion of the epilogue you read from, I was thinking about how you were wishing to return to Hartford Correctional, which is a very difficult journey. I can only imagine to go back to that carceral space. And it's very unusual because for me as a teacher who's been going in and out of Texas men's prisons teaching now for nearly 15 years, I noticed that the students who leave, many of them profess a desire to never go back to that space again. And they want to journey far away from that. And they hope and pray that they will not be returned to that space, especially equipped with college degrees. And this last Saturday, I had the privilege of listening to watching a graduation ceremony at our chapel on the prison grounds. So it was an in-person event after all of this, years of pandemic distance. This is the first time I ever saw a person return from the so-called free world. And he spoke about his educational journey. So he was wearing, white jeans and a red t-shirt. And I was just struck. I was like, this is a person who has returned. And in his very soaring speech he gave to the students in the chapel, he said, nothing is free in the free world. And I was thinking when I was listening to you that you seem to have so much to share. Like, I feel like your epilogue is the beginning of another work and something else in the works, like you have more addendum to the correctional. And I was wondering, as you're also reading that you have, you're in conversation with like Clint Smith's How the Word is Passed on monuments and what he writes, and Isabel Wilkerson on caste, of course. And I feel like there's so many great writers and thinkers you're in conversation with. So I feel like, are you thinking more about a continuation to your memoir that is a addendum correctional to the correctional?
Well, it is. The epilogue actually kind of opens up some things that I can't really quite encapsulate in the short space, but I needed to. And this is where I should say you were so helpful in that when the book had to go through peer review, part of the comments that I got back was about where the book ended. And of course, the process of writing and revising, it takes so long that by the time I was ready for publication, 2020 had happened and George Floyd and all of these things. And so I had to recast the book.
Yeah.
And there are some things there about mental health, about gender, that I think really could be expanded on. But I mean, at the moment, I'm so tired of the personal self. And I feel like the next thing that I write will probably be pretty far away. It'll be, you know, erotic speculative fiction or something. I don't, who knows, but I do think that there are parts of that I'm still kind of coming to terms with and digesting and synthesizing. We'll write about probably.
It is, I mean, it is exhausting. I think the art of writing memoir, I can imagine, and it is very difficult, soul draining, but also, of course, invigorating. But it's hard work. It's exhausting. I can imagine to go back to that space. But as a poet, it feels like you're especially equipped to write really well and with a closed lens. You pay attention to language and you pay attention to your own life in a way that makes the book very vulnerable and very honest. And as I was telling you just before, like I'm looking forward to taking this book to my students and having them interrogate the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, and which is really my hope and really the impetus. I knew that as a writer, when I realized that I was going to have to do this kind of pretrial detention, that I would have to call upon my abilities as a writer to survive. And I imagined myself almost an immersion journalist, and I anticipated doing something with this experience. But when I had these conversations with these men, who in my normal life I probably never would have encountered, and I spent this time with them, and we shared details of our family. We were trying to pass time. We talked about everything under the sun, and I made them a promise that I would really do something with their stories. And so that was when I knew I had to. But you're right. I mean, it's so excruciating writing about your life, writing about people who don't particularly want to be written about, who are in your life. But I do really believe in bibliotherapy and life writing and the power of reclaiming your own story, because especially on the inside, all the institutional forces are towards silence, self-surveillance, a kind of a co-opting of your story and a dehumanizing of the population. And if you're given the tools to be able to tell your story, then I think it can help you heal, certainly, and reintegrate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the power of the narrative. So I feel like, so while you were also talking, I was thinking about how, you know, your memoir contends so much with community making. You speak about your South Asian, Indian, Tamram background, and the communities you drifted through were formed by, and then the academic community to which you gained, you know, admission, and now, you know, you have suffered levels of also removal from that community, and you found your way back in it. And then also the carceral community. And now it feels like you're doing really important work on the ground with activists and thinkers and movers and shakers. So it feels like, I'm just wondering how you are thinking about community at this point for yourself.
Yeah, it's a really, I mean, I think when you go through something really difficult, it's a litmus test as to who truly believes in you, who is loyal in some ways. And I've had to kind of remake my community. And you're right. I mean, I've gone from being a tenured full professor back to being a lecturer. I'm at an institution where I'm really happy. But, you know, I've found that many people who I was very close to at the time drifted away. It's almost as if you have an illness and people don't know what to say, and they feel like they can be tainted just by associating with you. And you know, my case in particular, though, I just had these misdemeanor offenses. As I mentioned, I was in the Hartford Courant 8 or 10 times. It was really big public news in Connecticut. And that really taught me a lot about the limitations of journalism and the ways in which there's a sensationalism that's inherent to particular journalistic narratives that there's no deviation from. But you're right. It forced me in a way to kind of because I mean, my experience, what I knew theoretically, and I think what many people in the audience probably know about, is that the criminal justice system is racially disparate, pretty broken in its operations, but actually having experienced it, I felt and I feel really committed to trying to do work to both educate the public about what is happening and also to shift the paradigm, because it feels like such a colossal waste of so much human potential. And so yes, I've kind of I have been connecting with different organizations. I will be teaching in Concord, Massachusetts prison in the fall, doing this work with a theater group. I'm doing work with reentry and helping people with their resumes and other things. But you're right. I mean, there is a way in which when you have gone through the stigmatization of the carceral system, it is a kind of scarlet letter that you wear. And that makes it very easy for any employer to immediately, push your application to the bottom of the pile. And so, I mean, I feel like I'm an advocate for intentional inclusion and for reentry, not only because I've been helping all of these people, but because I've been struggling with some of these challenges personally as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sure, I'm thinking about a lot about the moment we're in, which I kind of always mix up in my head, moment and movements, because that's kind of they somehow relate to each other. But I'm thinking about the movements for racial and social justice that have been continuing, the movements for the rights of citizens, like the voting rights movement, which is important for incarcerated people as well, and the rights of all human beings, migrants, refugees, travelers across borders. Then I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock. Of course, in Texas, I'm thinking about the LGBTQ movement that really has, these movements have to go on because the work has to be done in many of these states. And of course, I'm very excited about the labor movement that has made massive leaps, because I've been looking at the incredible achievements made by people like Chris Smalls and Derek Palmer in Staten Island, where I'm from. And my students earning college degrees while in a Texas prison, that they continue to march forward into light, promised within the dark print on yellowed pages. So I'm just kind of thinking about a little more, if you can just talk about freedom, because you ended on that word, and that word is really, it's a weighty word. And I know you're a poet and you think about words, and words are dancing in your head all the time. And I'm just thinking sort of, do you have to reconfigure the meaning of that word each day, as with all the various successes you've had and also challenges you keep facing, sort of?
Yeah, I mean, I think I asked that question of what it means to be free, and there's a way in which it's very easy to be despondent. I mean, my experience with the criminal justice system, and I was someone who could afford, a private attorney who used to be a former state prosecutor and was very well connected in the court. And I still, for my driving on a suspended license, had to do as much time as the Stanford swimmer who raped an unconscious Chanel Miller, 90 days had to do. And so there's something in our criminal justice system that is kind of irretrievably broken. And I think I'd like to look at the historical roots of how that kind of started, and our Puritan forebears brought over from England the bloody codes, very primeval and brutal practices of kind of public executions and maimings and floggings. And the Quakers, who were the more liberal party of the time, thought that jails, which used to only be a place where you would house prisoners before they would be transported to trial, could actually be an end in and of itself, and a more humane alternative to the barbaric practices of the bloody codes. And But I think what they didn't realize is this whole puritanical idea of shaming would only increase when it got pushed into this subterranean space, because, you know, jails are not just meant to keep people in it, they're built to keep the public out. And so, you know, when I think about that word freedom, I mean, I always think of the primary kind of the hypocrisy that the very men who were writing the Declaration of Independence and advocating for this idea on behalf of their citizens also owned slaves at the same time. And so there is a way in which the notion of freedom has been different based on who you are and where you come from. And but I also think the amazing thing that I found is that the mind has this amazing capacity to be free in spite of the institutional pressures that exist. And I found that particularly hearing the stories of some of the men and seeing the communities that they made, that they were working towards a certain kind of freedom, even in the confines of the prison system. But you know, I also think, I mean, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I actually feel I came out of this experience feeling quite hopeless, and then I started working on my book, and I started connecting with these activists and these communities, and I now actually feel pretty hopeful. I mean, I think that there are this generation's freedom riders who exist, who are doing the work. And there are these great national organizations, from, you know, the Marshall Project to the Southern Law Poverty Center to really localized regional organizations that are trying to do this work. And so I feel like, because, and that was the other thing that was so shocking to me, and I suppose most of us know this, but I didn't realize that this rash of mass incarceration is a pretty modern phenomenon. Really, you know, from 1980 to the current moment, we see the kind of exponential increase in the prison population, and of course we see no real drop in public safety or crime rates. And then you overlay that with the demographic of who is actually being imprisoned, and it's a stark picture of what is happening under the noses of all of us in the greatest democratic country on earth, right? So
yes, exactly. The early 70s, we had criminologists and scholars wondering, what are we going to do? Our numbers are dwindling. We're thinking possibly many prisons will close. And then there's the boom of the prison industrial complex as we enter this late stage capitalism. Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question from an audience member that I am going to make sure I share. It's a question from Arlene Plevin. She says, Norway practices a concept of restorative justice, and they provide and support for re-entry. What do you think is the one thing American society should do to help get a better system, better justice?
Yeah, and I'm really glad, because part of what I did while I was writing this book is I had this fellowship at the University of Sydney looking at the roots of mass incarceration and its racialization. And one of the things, I mean, and this is why I think it's not a Democratic or Republican issue, it's a human issue, because very clearly taxpayers are paying a lot. And in Rhode Island, it costs almost $75,000 per prisoner for incarceration, and over a quarter of that goes towards security costs and administrative costs. And so there's this great expense, and yet the rates of recidivism in the US are among the highest of any country in the developed world. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it almost seems like there is a kind of investment in failure when it comes to the criminal justice system. And so Norway is a good example. They have one of the lowest recidivism rates. They don't give life sentences, for one, so they believe that they know that the incarcerated population will re-enter society, and so they do want to equip them with, I believe, social workers and mental health workers on premises. Some of the prisoners, you know, the old joke is that some of the Norwegian prisons are nicer than the Brooklyn brownstones that some of us have lived in. But the truth is they're trying to actually equip these men and women,
Mm.
give them skills and help them reintegrate, and they're treating them compassionately. And so I think that does make a difference. But the one thing I have to say, I mean, I think I'm probably more of an abolitionist. I mean, I think there probably are problems
Mm.
in Norway as well, which is quite a homogenous population. And I feel like, well, if there's one thing that I could do as a prisoner commissioner, certainly nonviolent offenders and low-level drug charges, these are things that people should not be imprisoned for.
Mhm.
And I think taking out the profit motive in the carceral system, I mean, the ways in which corporations and industries can profit off of the bodies of these prisoners by paying them suppressed wages and forcing them to do labor. I mean, I think if you take out those incentives, then that will help start to begin to reform. But there is so much that is really broken, and I think deeply historically embedded from the very start. You know, Connecticut, where I write this book, is the Constitution state, and it's because it propagated all of these laws. And laws, of course, we know are culturally relative, and yet you can use laws to make those who are undesirable and marginalized even more so, right? You can kind of police them, and that, I think that's what we find happening.
Absolutely, exactly. It's woven into the fabric, this very structure, the constitutional the system in place. And we have the Amendment 13 that ensures that people will be funneled into this carceral system and kept there. Yeah. So yeah, please feel free to keep asking questions, because I have a number and I will be happily asking more. Were you about to say something, Ravi?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
So this week I was just telling you about my students in the classroom, and they were just reading Mohsin Hamid's novel, Exit West. And there's this really wonderful moment in this novel where he's sort of speaking about all different Americans, different type of people in the world. And there's this older Chinese woman in San Francisco, longtime resident. And she sees the city change around her. She doesn't recognize anything. Who are these people? And the chapter ends by saying, we're all migrants through time. And we're all migrants through time. And as you can imagine, I went quickly over that chapter because I was so gripped by the story of Nadia and Saeed, the main protagonists. But my students brought up that, and that's the beauty of my students, because they always read even more closely than I do. That's the gift. And they all grappled with that sentence. So I was wondering, for you, as a child of immigrants, you've been everywhere, you've crossed continents, carceral spaces, universities, you've crossed borders. And, what you might say about that sentence, we're all migrants through time, because my students would not stop talking about it.
Yeah, that is, I think that I believe that everyone should live in a place where they are a marginalized member of that population. I think it is such an instructive feeling to be the other, because I think a lot of times we are in these communities that we've created and we don't really have that feeling. And I think there's another really wonderful line in that book. To love is to enter into the inevitability of one day not being able to protect what is most valuable to you. And I feel that to make yourself so vulnerable, and of course that is the thing, right? That we are these brief inheritors of this planet, and we have more in common with one another than we have differences among each other. And so that's why I really feel that nationalism, these kinds of, even I'm really supportive of everyone celebrating their identity, but I think identity politics can become really cloistered and accentuate our differences, when in fact what it means to be part of the human community is to embrace these differences and to live together harmoniously. Yeah. That's the hope, at least. And so, yeah, what a beautiful idea that we're all migrants through time. And there's something really democratic about that idea, I think.
Absolutely.
Equivalence for all of us, no matter where we might come from.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. That's great that you were thinking about this sentence about love, because love does render us vulnerable, especially when you love deeply and love radically and love across borders, as you have done. Yeah. So, I'm just making sure that there's any more questions if I've missed, but I was wondering about, I just love many of your lists, Ravi. I've enjoyed so many of the lists that you keep. Intuitively, you keep constructing them in your novel. So at one point, you talk about the greatest voices of literature, philosophy, tradition, who have suffered the worst of their times and often served time. So you mentioned Cervantes, O. Henry, and some of my favorites as well, like Jimmy Santiago Baca, Etheridge Knight. And to this list, I can add our more recent favorite, I think a friend of yours, Reginald Dwayne Betts. So I'm just wondering if you're finding also the writers who are currently writing of and against prisons, like are you sort of communing with them? And also larger question is, what do you think words can do to walls? I mean, it's my secret agenda here is, of course, talking about humanities, just to lay it out there how humanities are important. But yes, my question is, what can words do to walls?
Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned Reginald Dwayne Betts, who's a terrific poet and memoirist. And he's now doing a lot of programming to bring books into prisons. And he edited a folio for the Michigan Quarterly Review on persecution, which I had a little excerpt from Correctional Appeared, but it also had excerpts from someone writing about an Afghani jail and imprisonment internationally. I also discovered the work of Austin Reed, who is, this book was one of the more recently published books, and yet it's the earliest example of a prison memoir by an African-American man, written about the 1850s in Auburn. And this book was just found and authenticated by some Yale scholars and an antiquarian books sale. And it's a fascinating text. It's a memoir that has sections of magical realism woven into it that bears witness to the really horrific kinds of abuses that these prisoners were enduring back then. I mentioned this idea of bibliotherapy before, but I feel really deeply that many of the men that I met had these traumatic wounds that they hadn't been able to process, in part because they didn't have the language to access those spaces. And that by showing, sharing texts from other people who have experienced some of these circumstances, and also providing the kinds of skills that allow people to tell their own stories, I think it's revelatory, it's transformative. It makes such a big difference, because all of a sudden, what's happening on the inside is that there's this pressure towards dehumanization. From the moment you're given an inmate number to the ways in which the correctional officers speak to you, you're stripped of your humanity. And yet, if you can have the tools with which to engage with ideas, with other books, with your own inner self, it can really be very powerful, whether ultimately you publish a book that you will share with other people, or if you just do work in a journal. It is the kind of thing that, instead of keeping bottled up, you allow expression and articulation. I think it can really help expedite the healing process. And I've seen that happen in my own writing workshops.
Yeah, healing. Yes, healing. We always come back to that, and that's so fundamental for our lives. And there's a question here. Let me make sure that I ask that. There's a question about your writing routine. How often, for how long do you write for? What is your next writing project? And this is, I think, coming from Ishita.
Oh, yes. Well, as a poet, I'm always kind of working on different things. I have a collaboration at the moment with.
Oh, sorry, it's Alka. Alka. The question is from Alka, yes. Korean. Yes, go on.
I try to make a point, because when you teach writing, you can spend a lot of time reading student writing and then not making enough time for your own creative practice. And I always try to be working on something and probably multiple things simultaneously. And so my writing practice usually in the mornings is when I will try to do some writing. And I also have found collaboration to be a really rich and fertile source of starting new projects. And so I'm working on this poem with the Australian poet Mags Webster, where we're kind of going back and forth. And that's been really useful. And then I also believe in the community aspect of writing reviews. And so part of what I did with the University of Sydney is a critical exegesis that I don't know if I'll have the time or inclination to turn it into a book, but there is some interest, and it's about prison memoirs by American men of color. But I have to say, going back into all of the heavy theory and footnoting and citations was quite difficult for me as a creative practitioner. But I guess the goal I set for myself each day is that I have done some creative act, and hopefully some selfless act as well. If I can if I can at the end of the day say I've done both of those, then it's been a pretty successful day. And so I don't say I have to write X amount of words. Sometimes I may just be fiddling with a poem, and other times I might be writing something new, but as long as I'm engaged in some way with the practice, I feel pretty satisfied.
Oh, that's great. That's great. And so I have I think they're about to conclude our event, but I have a question for you. What is a question, Ravi, that you want to receive, but haven't yet received in your journey? Because I know you've been on the circuit being interviewed.
Wow, that's a really great question. I have gotten some really unexpected questions like, oh, well, when your book is turned into a movie, what actor would you want to play you? And I've gotten some really random questions, but the question, well, I think the question maybe is, what can each of us do in face of this problem? I think that there is a way in which you can be a really woke, kind of liberal-minded intellectual, and yet be complicit in the very systems that are unequally propagating power. And so I think that not just be tacit, but to act in some small way, whether it is by contacting your legislative bodies, by connecting with communities, giving money, whatever it is that you can do, that is not just liking a post or retweeting something, but that actually actively is engaged. And that is my ultimate hope, is while I worked really hard on the craft of the book and the architecture, and we haven't talked about many of the strands in the story, but my hope is that those of you that read it, that it is not just a static literary artifact, but something that makes you want to get involved in some way, because I really believe that this work that we're doing and the communities that we're creating constitute really the future of our country and of our planet.
Absolutely. That's really very, I feel like, a hopeful and an action-oriented sort of ending. It feels like you're giving us tasks to do in terms of thinking and doing, and I just I really recommend that those who haven't yet read your work to purchase your book and to read it, to engage with it, to talk to their families about it, because I feel like this is a book worthwhile in many different circles, including South Asian circles, South Asian studies, South Asian communities.
We didn't really talk about that, but this is kind of a little bit of the anti-model minority myth book, right? Yes, my mother did not want me to write this book, and it's a very, certainly experiences I never anticipated.
Absolutely, but I feel like it is well worth it. And in this moment when books are again getting censored and the lists of censored books are getting lengthier, it is really important to read this work and to know that this work is in conversation with so many other great works by figures like Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and your Reginald Wayne Betts, and poets, writers, thinkers, Isabel Wilkerson, Clint Smith. I mean, I just keep thinking about all the people who are doing this important work, and your text is in conversation with. And I was just really deeply moved by a memoir in a way that sometimes memoirs can leave you in a different space, but this memoir, I feel like it's really an awakening, and it's a call to action. Yeah. And I think you have also one more comment from Alka about what is your emotional journey for writing this book? How easy, how difficult is it? And if you want to sort of think about that and just give your concluding comments as well, that would be ideal.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Alka. And I have to say, well, it's been fairly excruciating, and in doing some of these book events and talking about that time, I realized it's re-traumatizing in some ways. I've published really very widely as a poet and critically, and yet this work was really very different because I felt that I had to first be authentic, and I had to transcend the bitterness that I felt. I mean, initially, the first drafts of the book, I think I felt quite embittered, and I felt I was treated unfairly, and yet the work of it had to do with me coming to terms with what I'd done and making amends with the people I might have hurt, and seeing my situation. That really took time, and it took the feedback from so many friends, readers, editors, people like Rekha. I think I didn't realize the book had 4 or 5 major revisions, and there were times where I put it away for about a year and a half, and because each time there was another excruciating layer of unpeeling that had to happen, and I had to get kind of more and more vulnerable, and admit things that I probably, like my mother said, like my amma, wise amma, tells me, I've gotten through all of this time, why would I want to dredge it up and bring it back? And yet I feel compelled. I mean, this is my life that I've lived, and a story that I feel is a quintessential American story in many ways, even though it's my own personal journey. And so, yes, I was joking with Rekha before that I want to write something really very different next, because memoir is really hard work, and to focus so closely and keenly on yourself, and to try to tell the story as honestly as you're able to do is very difficult. And I will just say, in conclusion, I mean, my work, as Rekha mentioned, is in conversation. There's so many other terrific memoirs. I just finished recently Albert Woodfox's Solitary, about the time that he spent in Angola prison. Yes, I mean, I hope that you read Correctional. I would love to hear from you if you do. There are parts that are set in India, and describe my own bicultural upbringing, living in New York through 9/11. Of course, I'm sharing the name with the very famous sitar player. So I kind of touch on all of these different things, but ultimately, I hope my story lets you know that we share this planet with so many people who are related to us, and those who have been stigmatized as criminals are not these two-dimensional villains, but yet are these people who are as complicated as we are, who have some of the same dreams, hopes, and aspirations, and that if we can soften our heart, it would be better for all of us, because it would make for a much more productive and fulfilling society. So thank you so much. This has been really such a joy.
That's great, Ravi. Yeah, soft hearts. That's the goal. That's what I feel like I'm doing in the classroom.
Radical empathy and soft heart.
Thank you, Ravi.
So I'm so sorry to butt in to say what a powerful conversation it has been. Thank you so much, Ravi. Thank you so much, Rekha. You've just unraveled so many complex set of ideas about the meaning of life. In fact, I just finished teaching a class. I teach a class on world literatures, And I had a concluding session on Albert Camus' The Plague. And this is exactly what we were talking about, the meaning of life. And, when you're face to face with this kind of a calamity, when disaster strikes, what do human beings do? And I think Ravi, your concluding remarks are very telling, like you do something, you act because, you need to act rather than either commit suicide or commit a philosophical suicide. You act, because that's the only way you make sense of your life, but that's the only way in which you remain relevant as a human being. So thank you so much for that very powerful concluding remarks. And so here we are towards the end of this brilliant session. I would like to thank you from Tasveer, from my team at Tasveer, from Ishita, from Rita, and the whole of Tasveer team. We're so delighted to have been able to host you. Thank you so much, Rekha, for being our interlocutor. I've known Rekha for a long time, and I think this is the first time probably I'm seeing you via Zoom.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm actually sitting in my, Bothell. It's a new building, and I was desperately looking for a place from where I could join this conversation. And I'm glad to have been able to find a kind of a semi-sunny spot. Thank you so much for your effort. Thank you so much for your labor. And I just had a quick message for our listeners. This conversation has been recorded. And if our listeners haven't had a chance to listen to it fully or part of it, this discussion will stay on Tasveer's YouTube channel. And so we encourage all of you to subscribe to our channel and listen to all the great conversation that we have with authors such as yours and interlocutors, and also an author such as Rekha. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tasveer.
Bye.
Thank you, Rekha. This is
Bye.
great.
It was
Stay
beautiful.
safe, everyone.
And you. Bye-bye.